Hello, welcome to our first week on racial inequality. This is going to be a three-parter. But for this week, we're going to introduce race and cover a couple of classic readings on race and racism. And then in the coming weeks, we'll get into structural racism, interpersonal racism, and some more contemporary topics. The goals for this week are to finish our political inequality discussion. I know that we ended pretty abruptly in our classes last week, and actually I got a little further in one class session than the other. So we're going to finish political inequality, and then we're going to discuss race by defining race, identifying examples of race as a social construct, and then introducing Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. Here are your deliverables for this week. So as usual, you have your reading question due Monday night, your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night, and an assignment due this Friday. Your first exam is due Friday the 25th. This will be distributed on Inquire by Tuesday night, right? So have it there by Tuesday night, and you will have several days to complete the exam. There is no time limit except for the deadline of Friday night. I will add that to Inquire as a Word document that you will submit as a Turnitin assignment. All right, and there will be more instructions on the exam itself. So we're going to go a little bit out of order for the module this week because I want to give you all a video question to wrap up our topic for last week. We didn't have a lot of time to talk about the power elite in class. But I do want to show you an example of the power elite, one that I introduced in class, but we didn't have a whole lot of time to discuss. So we're going to do this using a video question. After you read the prompt, you can pause the PowerPoint module to answer this question. You will need to watch a video on super packs. The link is on Inquire. This is the same video that the Wednesday group already watched during our Zoom session last week, but the Friday group did not get to watch. So pause when you're ready, watch the super packs video, stop at about 2 minutes and 25 seconds. You don't need to watch the end on gerrymandering, and then answer this video question. What is a super PAC and what makes it different from a regular PAC? How do you think the issue of super PACs relates to Mill's power elite? All right, so you can pause now, watch the video, answer that question, and come back for our discussion on race. Now that we have wrapped up our power elite section, our political inequality section, I do have an opening question for you on race. Respond to 2 reading questions posted by your peers. To do this, use the reply link, and that will enable you to post your response right under the reading question that your peer posted. You can respond to a reading question that someone else has already answered. Of course, we're going to have this if you're all responding to 2 reading questions. Okay? These do not have to be very long responses. It can just be several sentences. But please do go on to Inquire now and respond to 2 reading questions posted by your peers, and then come back here for the rest of the module. So we are going to be talking about race and ethnicity over the next few weeks. And in preparation for those discussions, I want to go over some vocabulary, because I think there is some confusion about the terminology to use when talking about race and ethnicity, and when talking about particular racial or ethnic groups. And this is understandable because the terminology that we use evolves across time. There is no fixed set of vocabulary for talking about race because our classifications for race change across time, as we're going to get to in a minute, and because the terms that we use evolve depending on the meanings that are attached to them. So I do want to go over a few terms that we use today in order to guide us for our future discussion. So first, Black or African American. We have heard these terms used, sometimes used interchangeably. So which do we use? My short answer is that both of these are appropriate. And of course, I'm speaking from a position of privilege as a white person as we talk about vocabulary, as we talk about race over the next few weeks. But both African American and Black are used. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but African American is a term that is more specific to Black people with African ancestry who live in and often who were born in the US. And we often see African American used to refer to Black people living in the US who are descendants of people who were enslaved. Okay? African American is probably a term that you were taught to use in grade school or in high school, because this is the appropriate terminology. And in some cases, this is the preferred terminology. It depends on the person, and it depends on how somebody does or does not fit within what we classically define as African American. Now, Black is a broader term. It's broader than African American, and I think some of us have been taught that calling somebody Black is inappropriate. That is not true. And for some people, Black is preferred over African American. There are a few reasons why we may use Black instead of African American. First, it is more inclusive. It includes people who trace ancestry to the Caribbean. So hence people who do not have African ancestry, right? It wouldn't make sense to call somebody African American if they do not have African ancestry. Black is also preferred at times because it challenges the idea that Black people are immigrants and not real Americans. So the hyphenating of African American implies that there is some separation from being American. So Black is also used as a common way of describing Black people or African Americans, if the overlap is appropriate there. When we talk about ethnicity, we often use or hear terms Hispanic or Latino. Which to use? Often these terms are used interchangeably, though technically there is a difference. So technically, Hispanic refers to people from countries that speak Spanish. So that would include Mexico. That would technically include Spain. While Latino refers to people from Latin America. So this would be Mexico, Central America, South America. And there is a lot of overlap in those who would be considered Hispanic and Latino. However, there are exceptions to this rule. People from Spain typically are not considered to be Hispanic. If somebody with Spanish descent was to answer the census, they probably wouldn't mark Hispanic. People from Brazil who speak Portuguese, not Spanish, are typically considered to be Hispanic. All right, so there is this confusing set of terms that have a history in, a history rooted in language or in region, but we do see them overlapping and actually not used exactly as they were initially used, I would say. Now, person or people of color, or POC for short, this has become a common way to describe essentially people who do not identify as white. People of color is a very broad term. It encompasses all people who do not identify as white. There's actually a bit of, I would say, controversy or disagreement in the usage of this term, or the usage of non-white as a term, because it is describing what somebody is not. So person of color is used pretty commonly. It is not the same. And I will say, and I'm using this vocabulary that is not appropriate to use in order to share that it's not appropriate to use. The term colored people is not the same as people of color. Okay, there is a long history of the use of colored as a way of segregating African Americans, specifically in the US, during the segregation era. So people of color is not the same. I know that they sound like they would be interchangeable, but they have very different meanings. So we do use people of color, not colored people. If you want more information on this, and there's a lot more to say about the history of terminology used to describe people by race and ethnicity. If you want more information on this, I posted a document called Race Names, and this is on Inquire. It's by Pamela Oliver. It provides a great and detailed overview of the different terms that we have seen used throughout history and that we see used today for different racial and ethnic groups, and describes really the historical origins of these terms and which terms are appropriate and which terms are not. So I do recommend using this. So one question that's really at the core of our discussions this week is, what is race? How do we define race? How do we see race? And there are two prevailing perspectives throughout history. The first is the essentialist view. And this is the view that race is biological. It's biologically determined. There are defined categories, and we can easily fit people into those racial categories. The essentialist view also posits that racial categories are invariant and they're universal, meaning they don't change across time, they don't change across place. The racial categories that we have in the US are the same as the racial categories you would see elsewhere. This perspective really did dominate through the majority of US history, and we continue to see the essentialist view enacted in a number of ways. For example, we continue to see the essentialist view in medicine. Maybe not in all of medicine, but certainly race is used as a proxy for treatment of certain health conditions or medications that are going to be most effective for a particular person based on their race. Now, in contrast to the essentialist view, we have the constructionist view. And this is the view that I think has gained the most popularity and backing over the past several decades. The constructionist view really is a sociological perspective. This argues that race is a social construct and that there are social forces, such as our culture, our politics, our economic structure, history. These all shape the racial categories that we come to understand and the racial differences that we come to see. Expanding on this definition, in the essentialist view, we said that race is invariant across time and place. But if we're using a constructionist view, racial categories and meanings of race change across time and they change across place. And we see a number of examples of this. I'm going to show you one in just a moment. So the constructionist view is much more sociological. And I think this is one that our dominant culture has come to accept and come to understand. Race is constructed by us and by our culture, by our society. The constructionist perspective is described within the Omi and Winant reading that you did for this week. The authors state that even though we might use physical features to classify people into categories, we rely on the process of racial formation to really define what those categories are in the first place, to create them, to modify them, to eliminate them. And this all happens based on social context. Omi and Winant also describe several consequences of racial formation, including racialization. Racialization describes the attribution of characteristics to people based on race, and these characteristics were previously disconnected from race and had no connection to race at all. We might consider racialization to be synonymous with stereotyping or profiling based on race. For example, the harmful assumption that someone who is Muslim is violent or a terrorist. This is an example of racialization. I also want to show you an example of racial formation. And one good example is how racial categories have changed across time in the US Census. The 1790 census had 3 categories, and this was the first census in the US. And those 3 racial, I suppose you could call them racial categories, the 3 categories were free white males and females, other free persons, and persons who were enslaved. That was the race question on the census in 1790. And since then, we have seen the addition of many categories, the renaming and restructuring of categories, the subtraction of some categories. We have seen shifting definitions of race, and we've seen changes to who is included in particular racial categories. There are a number of reasons for these changes across time, and it has to do with our politics, our culture, the composition of our country as well. So migration is one reason for changes in racial classifications on the census. But we also see xenophobia or anti-immigrant sentiment driving the addition or subtraction, naming of categories in US history. Lobbying from special interest groups who want certain racial identities to be added or renamed. We also see rules of hypodescent in racial classifications on the census. And this means that any amount of non-white heritage, by the definition or rule of hypodescent, makes a person non-white. Right? And they do not use white as their racial classification, even if the majority of their heritage is white. The concept of whiteness is also amorphous and changing across time. Who's included in the white category within the census? And we've seen changes in how people respond based on different nationalities or different ethnicities. The 2020 census, which is currently underway, I believe, or I know it was being cut short, which is problematic for a whole number of reasons. But the 2020 census has a new way of measuring race. For the first time in the history of the census, there are fill-in sections for people to put countries of origin. So if you put white, what countries of origin, did your ancestors come from? And so this is a way of breaking down race into nationality. We can talk more about this in class, but I do want you to see the US Census as an example of the construction of race, because we see changes in how race is classified across time in the census. So now for your content question, and this was related to that example of the US Census and racial formation within the US Census. I want you to go to the Pew Research Center's website. The URL is right here. I'm also going to include it on Inquire, so you can click the link instead of typing from the PowerPoint module. I want you to click on or open this link and then click on any census year. You're going to see an option for 1790 and then each census after that. Once you click on that census year, you're going to see a comparison of the census and the racial classifications for that census year to the classifications in the 2020 census. So I want you to respond to this. How did racial classifications differ during the time period that you selected compared to 2020? I do want you to note that some of the vocabulary used for racial classification in the past is actually considered inappropriate or offensive today. You may refer to these classifications in your response here, but please recognize that a number of terms used in the census in the past are not used today and should not be used when discussing contemporary racial and ethnic classifications. And if you're not sure, you can look it up. But I will allow you to address it here in answering this question. But really do think about the way or the meanings that some of these terms have today. All right, so you can pause now, answer that question, and come back for the remainder of the module when you are done. Now let's talk about Du Bois. And you did a reading by Du Bois for this week. And I know it's a tough reading, but it is a very important one. Du Bois was one of the most, or is one of the most, prolific race scholars in US history. He was an author, philosopher, activist, sociologist, historian, and he did die during the height of the civil rights movement. But in the reading that you did for this week, you see that he took a very philosophical perspective on race and struggled to define race and to define Black identity in the US. He considers races to be spiritually distinct groups that are rooted in different history, politics, religion, and culture. And the central conflict in the reading that you did in a lot of Du Bois's writing is how to embrace Blackness or how to embrace African roots while also integrating into American society. And this is something that he called double consciousness. We're going to spend a little bit of time on double consciousness. And I think this term may be important when you get to your next film analysis. This is a rather long quote from the reading for this week by Du Bois, and Du Bois describes double consciousness here as an inner identity conflict among African Americans. He describes a sense of two-ness from being both American and Black. You do see this in this quote from the reading. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. Measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. I'll let you read the entire quote, but really what he's describing here is the view of Blackness in the US and how Blackness is viewed with contempt and pity, as he states. And this leads to a conflict between embracing and erasing African heritage. This double consciousness really is at the root of a lot of his writing, as I said, and we can talk about ways in which we continue to see double consciousness today. So if double consciousness is the struggle to embrace one's Black identity within an American society that rejects and diminishes Blackness, we might see social consequences for Black people who publicly embrace Black identity, especially in spaces that are considered to be mainstream or popular culture. We see an example of this in Beyoncé's 2016 Super Bowl performance. This was an amazing performance, and Beyoncé is a very successful Black woman. But this performance was considered by some to be anti-police because of her use of Black Power and Black Panther symbolism in the performance itself. And this shows the risk of embracing Black identity and the risk of celebrating and expressing Black identity in a public space. We could consider this to be an example of why double consciousness exists as a problem, because there is the conflict between being Black and being American within a white American culture. Now, my closing question for you this week is a little bit different from the usual. I want to know what contemporary issues relating to race and racism you want to discuss in class in the coming weeks, because there's a lot to discuss and there are a lot of contemporary issues that we can talk about. We won't be able to talk about everything, but I really hope that we can discuss some of the issues that are really on your minds. So please, at this point, pause the module, answer the closing question, and then come back for the final slide. We have one important change for class this week. For those who want to and those who choose to, we will be meeting in class. So the in-class group will be meeting on Wednesday. I have posted an updated list of students who are meeting in class on Wednesday. And I will also send out an email with that information. Zoom group. So the Zoom group is for folks who are not coming to class on Wednesday. You will be meeting on Zoom on Friday during our usual class time. And in our classes, whether it is in the classroom or on Zoom, we will discuss the social construction of race and ethnicity, and we're also going to talk further about double consciousness, so please come prepared to discuss.